one of my favorite recipes today. This is for the holidays. It's actually called a fermented cranberry orange chutney, or relish if you want to call it a relish. It certainly is. And I'll give you a list of the ingredients. There are very few. Cranberries, whole cranberries, about a pound, washed, cleaned, picked through. You want only the very best that came in that bag. You'll use a cup of golden raisins. You could use dark raisins, but I always use the golden. The recipe I have calls for 3/4 of a cup of raw cane sugar. I am going with 2/3 of a cup today. I'm ratcheting back the sugar just a little. I'd like it to be a little less sweet, but you do need, especially with cranberries, you do need a certain amount. I might even try a 1/2 cup at some point. Well, actually I did that once and it was a little too tart. So I'm trying 2/3 of a cup today. The thing about testing your sugar is it really doesn't matter as long as you start out with at least half of the sugar that you're doing in this recipe. If it's tart when you're finished after 1 to 3 days, you can always add a little bit more sugar and let it sit for another day. So all is not lost when you're experimenting with how much sugar you like in this recipe. I also have roughly a tablespoon, or actually about 2 teaspoons of grated ginger. This is an optional ingredient. And a zest of 1 orange, and some of the pulp. Once in a while I'll use all of the pulp. Just what I'll do is zest the orange, take a serrated knife and peel off from around the pulp all of the pith, because the pith adds bitterness. And with the tartness of the cranberries, you don't really need the extra bitterness. So I cut off all of the pith, then I chop up the pulp and I add it into the recipe. That also is optional, but most of the time I will do that. So it's the pulp of the orange and the zest, but not the pith. All right, now what I start out doing, you'll be using your food processor. Almost everybody uses a regular food processor, but I happen to have a food processor attachment for my KitchenAid, and I use this to slice. I'm using a slicer blade to slice my cranberries. Now I think you could use the chopper blade and just do a lightly rough chop. I think the degree of fineness of your chop depends on what you like, but I like it rough. Now let's start. We'll put this on. I'll just show you the beginning and then we'll come back. We'll stop and we'll come back. Now, because that makes so much noise, I just want to show you. You see how that slices these up? It just looks delicious that way, all the red and the white. Now, I will show you something. This is a finished chutney, and after it sits for a while, the red color goes all the way through, so you can see the difference between the two. It looks good both ways, and actually it's very tasty the first day even after you make it. All right, I'll be back in a few minutes after I finish chopping the rest of this. Okay, I finished chopping the cranberries. I'll add the golden raisins, orange zest and pulp, cane sugar. I do know of some recipes that use raw honey, and I think that would be good in this recipe too. You'd probably use just a little bit less of that. And the ginger. It's That's really all there is to it. And stir this up. See how easy? This is really all there is to this recipe, except for letting the flavors marry for about 1 to 3 days. Now, the first thing is once you mix this, you're going to want to let them get used to each other, relax, and there'll be a certain amount of shrinkage. So you let it sit in this dish bowl for about an hour or two before you fit it into, I think this recipe will fit into this quart jar. We'll see in just a minute. Once it shrinks just a little bit as it sits here, it'll fit into a quart jar, and you'll use a simple lid to finish it. Now, I'll show you, this is my last batch. This was a double recipe, and this jar is a 1.5 liter Fido jar. You don't have to have a jar like this. I do really like them, but you don't have to have them. It's not really necessary. And this is nearly gone. That's why I'm making a new batch, because this will be gone in our house in just a couple of days. We use it on waffles. My husband actually puts it on toast with his jelly. I sometimes, when I want a light sweet snack, will eat a tablespoon or two out of a bowl just as it is. But it's also very good tossed into fruit breads for the holidays, and of course the standard to be served with roast turkey or pork. Now, I have an empty jar here. This also is a 1.5 liter jar. I generally will double the recipe I'm showing you today. And if I were to have doubled that today, this would have been the jar that I used. And this is how it looks after an hour. I'll put it in the jar now. The sugar has begun to mix in with the fruits. It's making just a little bit of juices. There'll be more juices made by this as it sits a little bit longer. So let's put it in the jar now. Okay, as you can see, this just fits into a quart jar, and that was after sitting for about an hour. Now, if I were to double this recipe and use the 1.5 liter jar, I would let this sit for 2 to 3, even 4 hours to shrink up enough, because this is going to be double this volume to double the recipe, and this is only 1.5 liter. But a double recipe, if it sits a little bit longer before you put it in the jar, will fit into that size jar. And then all that needs to be done after this is to place a lid on it, leave it on your kitchen counter for 1 to 3 days for those flavors to marry, and a certain amount of controlled fermentation begins, which also gives it some wonderful, wonderful probiotics into the recipe. But anywhere from 1 to 3 days, you can put it back into the refrigerator. It just depends upon you. I always leave it 3 days and then refrigerate, and it is delicious.